right, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to get started for this plenary session. We are delighted to have you here for this plenary, Church History as an Indispensable Source of Wisdom for Contemporary Ministry. My name is Karin Maag, and I am the director of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies and professor of history at Calvin College. It's my great delight to be moderating this session. We have 4 panelists, and we're going to do all this in 1 hour, so hang on tight. We're going to be moving pretty quickly. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Catherine González. She is Professor Emerita of Church History at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. In 1974-75, she was the first woman to preach a series in the widely respected radio program, The Protestant Hour. An ordained Presbyterian minister, she has devoted her time to the theological education of women and to the history of worship and spirituality. In 2006, the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA honored her with its award for excellence in theological education. Her best-known book is a commentary on 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude for the series Belief, a theological commentary on the Bible, published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2010. She is also the author of Resources in the Ancient Church for Today's Worship, published by Abingdon Press in 2014. Her presentation title for us this morning is Communion, From Common Loaf to Wafers and Back Again. Please join me in welcoming Professor González. You might need to use this. I don't know the other one.
Oh, okay.
Don't turn it too close.
Let's see if this one, okay. For the early church, the common loaf was absolutely essential. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians, "Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one loaf." And Augustine in the late 4th century preached on that Corinthian text to the newly baptized who had just received their first communion. In order not to be scattered and separated, eat what binds you together. Just as this turns into you when you eat it, so for you, for your part, turn into the body of Christ when you live devout and obedient lives. So you are beginning to receive what you have also begun to be. The bread that was used in communion was the common bread, the daily bread of the time. If the original Last Supper was a Passover meal, then unleavened bread would have been used. But the church, both East and West, apparently used leavened bread most commonly through the first 5 centuries. How did the common loaf become little wafers in the Middle Ages? The early Middle Ages, about 500 to 1000 AD, are called the Dark Ages for good reason. It was a time of chaos. There were no educational structures. Libraries had been destroyed. Many important changes in the life of the church, including and almost especially the liturgy, occurred in this time period. And yet there are few documents that tell us exactly what happened. Several Germanic tribes had entered Europe from the north and east, conquering what had been the Western Roman Empire. Though they were conquerors, they were open to the faith of the empire they had conquered. In the process of simplification and adaptation of the gospel to these newcomers, there developed an understanding that in communion, the bread and cup were actually changed into the physical body and blood of Christ. In the old Roman Church, before these invasions, there had been a strong sense of the presence of the risen Christ in the communion meal, and an understanding that somehow we became part of his body by receiving the bread which was his body. Justin Martyr speaks of the Eucharistized bread, that is, bread over which thanks has been given, has the power to be the body and blood of Christ when we receive it, uniting us with Christ and with each other. But in the form that these new Christians understood the matter, There was simply a clear physical change of the bread and wine into the body of Christ. Pope Gregory I, Bishop of Rome from 590 to 604, was very concerned about evangelizing and teaching these tribes. He said that in the Mass there was an unbloody re-sacrifice of Christ. This understanding that the bread actually was the body and blood of Christ led to an increasing fearfulness associated with receiving the elements. Many people attended Mass, but refused to receive communion because of such fears. Gradually, the common loaf, with the possibility of crumbs, disappeared. Some simple forms of crumbless, individual pieces of bread were introduced. This was probably a local decision that helped to encourage the faithful to receive communion, although many people still refused. Even more precautions were taken. The priest placed the bread on the tongue. A plate was held underneath. There were probably diverse practices, all trying to solve the problem of how the faithful could receive communion without courting danger. This was a gradual process, but by the late 9th century, individual wafers of some form were generally the accepted practice, especially among the philosophically unsophisticated tribes in the northern areas of Europe. The use of unleavened bread in the form of wafers gradually moved south and eventually, and lastly, to Rome itself. By the beginning of the 11th century, the process of change from leavened to unleavened bread was complete. There was no end of defense of the use of unleavened bread. What needs to be realized is that these rationales, biblical and theological, are in defense of a new form, in defense of the change from leavened to unleavened bread. There had been centuries from the earliest period when leavened bread had been the norm, simply because it was the common daily bread of the people. Nor had there been undue concern with crumbs, since the earlier theology affirmed the presence of the risen Lord in the midst of the celebration and recognized that the unity of the people with their Lord and with each other was somehow connected with this Eucharistized bread. The changes to the bread reflect the changes in the theology as it was filtered through a new and very different culture, that of warrior tribes who had no written language until the Christian missionaries created one for them, a people as distinct from the ancient, urban, cultured Romans as could be imagined. But they were now both the strength and the future of the European Church from the 7th century on. So what happened at the Reformation? Protestants rejected transubstantiation and with it the fearfulness about crumbs. Some denominations retained the wafers, probably more out of custom and convenience as any theological rationale. The Anglican and Lutheran churches were generally of this pattern, and the later Methodists often followed the Anglican pattern. The Reformed tradition held that the common bread, the daily bread of the people, should be used. The Reformed tradition had two different wings from the very beginning in the 16th century. In the Zwinglian pattern, the people stayed seated in the pews during the 4 times a year the Lord's Supper was served. A loaf or partial loaf was passed through the pews. Calvin, however, wanted communion much more frequently, every Sunday, though the city council would not permit it. He assumed that people would come forward and a common loaf or loaves were used. While the 16th century might have recovered something of the early church's stress on the connection between the unity of the congregation and the bread, this was lost with the individualism of the later centuries. The celebrant had a loaf to break when the words of institution were said, but that was more for show than for any other symbolism. There was no connection between the one loaf and the one people. And even when the common bread was used, it was usually cut up into little pieces for individuals in the congregation. More recently, however, the recovery of the early understandings of communion, and especially the understanding about the common loaf, have caused some changes. Many congregations do use a common loaf, or several loaves if the congregation is large. Some churches use wafers, some because they believe only unleavened bread should be used, some because it is convenient. There is concern on the part of many of those who use a common loaf that it truly represent good and healthy bread. Paul's words still have great importance. We who are many are one body, for we all receive from the one loaf. How we put this into practice today is important for us all. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second speaker this morning is Professor Gerald Sittser. He serves as professor and chair in the Department of Theology at Whitworth University, where he has served for 25 years. He founded the MA in Theology program at Whitworth, as well as the Certification for Ministry program. He teaches courses in the history of Christianity, the history of Christian spirituality, and religion in American public life. He is the author of Water from a Deep Well, Christian Spirituality from Early Martyrdom to Modern Missionaries, The Will of God as a Way of Life, A Grace Disguised, A Grace Revealed, A Cautious Patriotism, the American Church and the Second World War, as well as many book reviews, chapters, and articles. His presentation for us this morning is Reviving the Catechumenate in a Post-Christendom World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sittser.
Thank you, Karin. Thank you so much for attending. My argument is going to be very simple, and I'm going to state that first. So after I speak my first 3 paragraphs, you can ignore the rest of it and pretty much come out good when it comes to the central argument of this particular mini lecture. Here it is. In a culture that is becoming increasingly post-Christendom, that is, unfamiliar and uncomfortable with the Christian worldview and a way of life, and unaffected by Christian institutions, that sort of thing. Christians must respond by building some kind of bridge, keyword, bridge, between the secular world and the world of the church to transition people from one to the other. Anything short of this, and the church will become not only increasingly alien, but alienating to the larger culture. By the way, this is not an argument for megachurches and seeker-friendly churches, as you'll see. That's not going to be my point at all. The early Christian period, I'll continue to argue, provides us with an example, perhaps even a model, although anytime you find something from the past, you have to adapt it in some way to the present. And it is called the Catechumenate. I didn't learn about this in seminary. I bumped into the term later on when I was doing research for my book, Water from a Deep Well. I became immediately fascinated by it, began to follow this trail and discover it all kinds of places in early Christian literature. I'll mention that in just a minute. This is what I discovered. Christians living in the first few hundred years of the church's history created the catechumenate to build that bridge. To build a bridge so that outsiders, mostly pagans, especially by the time you reach the 2nd century, could transition slowly and meaningfully from their world to the world of Christian faith and practice. Without the formation of this training program, because that's really what it was, a training program like the catechumenate, the Christian movement would have remained either a marginal cult or become just one more option in a culture already crowded with other religious alternatives, both old and new. In the former case, Christianity would have remained so separate from and suspicious of the larger culture that it would have slowly withered away, as most cults do over time, showing itself incapable of engaging the culture and winning converts. In the latter case, paganism would have simply absorbed Christianity into itself over time, adding Jesus to its pantheon of gods and Christian rituals to its repertoire of religious practices. Pagans in the Greco-Roman world loved to borrow, so they'd be always adding things. They were highly syncretistic. It would have been very easy for Christians to adapt to that, simply made Jesus another alternative. In both cases, either separation or adaptation, accommodation, the Christian movement would have lost its competitive advantage and gradually disappeared as the new, unique, and attractive religion it turned out to be. But it did not disappear. Now, this should astonish us. It created a robust identity, quite different and distinct from all its religious rivals. Over a long period of time, it won enough converts to outstrip these rivals, even when facing Rome's hostility. By the time Constantine comes on the scene, the story's pretty much done. He was simply a smart politician. He didn't actually do that much for Christianity. In fact, what he did do might not have been all that good. Surprising everyone, the Christian movement endured and eventually prevailed. There are many reasons for this success. A number of historians have addressed this over the centuries, from Gibbon to Harnack, more recently Bremer. All kinds of historians, Knock too, have tried to figure out what made Christianity so successful and competitive in the ancient world. And they've come up with all kinds of theories. Not one of them, except for Justo González, mentions the Catechumenate, this training program that prepared people for church membership. I'm going to suggest that was the primary reason for the church's success, at least from a human point of view, because it enabled converts to become genuine disciples and thus helped to produce a formidable community of Christians whose example of faith and obedience provided a clear and winsome alternative to Christianity's three major competitors: Judaism, Greek philosophy, and paganism. Now, we learn about this bridge from early Christian sources. There are all kinds of hints in the 2nd century. I think the Didache gives a hint, and Justin Martyr, Athenagoras' Plea, Tertullian, number of sources. But we get our best source that gives us a thorough presentation of this, and that's Hippolytus' Apostolic tradition, or whoever wrote it. It was a manual provided for the church in Rome that eventually spread. It had a lot of influence over a couple of hundred years in the entire Greco-Roman world. So I'm going to give you just a brief outline of what this catechumenate looked like. I'm sure this is familiar territory for at least some of you. First of all, this document, the Apostolic Tradition, explains the process of enrollment. Now, you need to consider that the Christian movement first moved into urban areas, and the Greco-Roman world was highly urban. Cities like Ephesus and Antioch and Rome and Alexandria were huge cities, somewhere between maybe 150,000 up to 750,000 people, and densely populated. That's where Christianity moved. And because Christianity didn't have buildings and the other kinds of material benefits that we enjoy today, it worked more organically. So this is how it would happen. Let's say you're a Christian, you're living in Ephesus, a city of some 250,000 people. You shop every day in the market, the Agora, and people start to notice that you're different. You don't visit the temples. You don't have little household gods. You don't follow the ritual practices of Rome. You do something different. And you have a happy marriage, and your kids are well-behaved, or something like that. So your neighbors begin to express interest. You have them over for dinner. You begin to introduce them to the Christian faith. You build a friendship. Eventually, you bring them to a church leader in your house church, and they interview them. Yes, interview them to see if they're ready to become a catechumen. And then they go through a 2 to 3 year process of training and preparation before they're ready for baptism and the other rites of initiation. And you become their sponsor. That is, you mentor them. You stay with them in relationship. this entire period of time. So that's the enrollment process. Secondly, the document requires church leaders to provide instruction to the catechumens. Once again, sponsors served as the relational link between the catechumens and the church, which put them in a position to clarify instruction and help apply it to the daily life of catechumens, as if participating in a kind of spiritual apprenticeship program. So instead of thinking of a classroom, think of how a surgeon is trained, or how somebody who does plumbing or car repair. You're working shoulder to shoulder with an expert. You're learning from them, and you're doing it with them. You'll notice the church becomes a kind of relational womb of evangelism. Now, no outline of instruction is provided in the early documents, but by the time we get to the 4th century, we have lots of examples of volumes of catechetical sermons and instruction. We have one from Augustine. We have his sermons. We've got John Chrysostom, Theodore of Mopsuestia, Cyril of Jerusalem. We have Egeria's description of that same thing when she visits Jerusalem. We've got this very thick and textured body of literature that explains what the, quote, curriculum was. The biblical story that culminates in Jesus Christ, so sort of a story theology, obviously creed, Lord's Prayer, 10 Commandments, that sort of thing. But what you need to observe is that it was not classroom instruction. And the goal was not simply a clear belief system, it was a change of behavior. So belief, belonging, and behavior became a seamless whole. We, influenced by the evangelical tradition, tend to separate those and always put belief first. But in that case, they would often put belonging first, and people would begin to behave like Christians even before they were baptized. At the end of this formal training program, thirdly, catechumens participated in a highly choreographed rites of initiation, which usually occurred during Holy Week and culminated on Easter, when the bishop administered baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. These rites of initiation were intended to reflect a spirit of solemnity and mystery, and they enabled the catechumens to pass from outsider to insider, as if crossing the Jordan River. From old life to new life, born again. From candidate to member, from death to resurrection. In one sense, they were invited into the story of salvation, and the rites and rituals actually exposed them or drew them into that story. So it wasn't merely intellectual, it was aesthetic at the same time. I won't go into all the detail about it, but it is an amazing account. There are exorcisms and anointing of oil, and there's fasting and vigils and instruction and a kind of scrutiny or examination where a bishop would ask the candidates or the catechumens not simply what they believed, but do you care for widows? Do you serve the poor? Do you visit people in prison? Imagine if we did that in a church membership class today. And then it culminated when they submitted to the waters of baptism and were confirmed with a cross, anointing of oil, and then received their first Eucharist. As Catherine mentioned to me, they were actually given 3 cups. One was a cup of water to drink for inward cleansing. A second was the cup of wine. And the third was a cup of milk and honey, the food of the promised land in the new kingdom. I mean, this is just fantastic stuff. And then later on, they would actually wear a white robe for 8 days, and they would go through a period of further instruction called the mystagogue. Cyril has got a series of sermons called the mystagogue. So does Christendom. These are actually worth reading, and they're all in print and in English. Well, Christendom emerged, as you know, during the Middle Ages through the long and complex process of the Christianization of Europe. Christendom refers to the period of Western history in which Christianity functioned as the official religion and the church as the dominant religious institution in society. It was assumed over time that people were largely Christian because they were born and baptized into the faith, and then sustained through some instruction, often very minimal, and of course through sacramental participation. The catechumenate disappeared. I've been studying that, trying to follow that trail, and I think I've got it figured out now exactly how that happened. I won't mention this now, but it kept resurfacing, but under different names. A rose by any other name is still a rose. And so the novitiate in monasteries, that was the catechumenate. Third order movements, if you've heard of those in the 13th and 14th century, third order Franciscans, Dominicans, the Beguines, same category, Brethren of the Common Life, that was a kind of catechumenate. We know something about catechisms in the Reformation. The Reformers intended to have those used in homes, fathers discipling their children, but that didn't work out so well. The Wesley method was a catechetical method. He actually refers to the early Christian catechumenate as his model when he was creating this in order to disciple people. Well, enough on that. 3 brief words of application. First, the church could reinstate the catechumenate in a modern setting. For some churches, the rite of confirmation would function as a useful setting for this, a robust kind of confirmation program that would be done in such a way that teenagers or adults going through this would actually become active church members rather than do a confirmation that really provides a pathway out of the church, which is what happens in a lot of mainline churches today. There would be others, a new members class, the same sort of thing. So you could actually create one that would be a lengthy process of, say, a year or 2, rather than something short. And you could actually disciple church members by having them serve as sponsors and go through it with the people. Second, the church could use important rites of passage as opportunities to develop a kind of modified catechumenate. For example, when doing infant baptism, if you belong to a tradition that practices that, you could require parents to go through a training program in raising covenant children and have veteran, successful parents mentor them. That would be an example. In the case of marriages, you would have veteran couples that you would train to mentor couples to get ready for marriage, and then meet with them for the 6 months or so after they're married, when they're really ready to do the good, hard work of learning about marriage because they're in it. Leadership would be another opportunity. Rather than simply electing elders and giving them an hour or 2 instruction, have the first year of an elder's tenure of service be in a training program before they actually serve in office. And elders that are retiring could be the ones that were actually doing that training and introduce them to living a holistic Christian life rather than simply one that is attending meetings and running the business affairs of the church. Now, this is obviously a symposium on worship, not in the catechumenate. Yet, in my mind, without some kind of training program, I even think worship itself will become increasingly unfamiliar and unattractive to people who simply don't feel like they belong. Or if they do belong, they'll do worship the kind of same old way in a very remote manner. So worship should probably include instruction and practice even as the congregation worships. If we don't do this, we're going to lean in the direction of becoming seeker-friendly to such a degree that our worship life, our theology life, and our liturgy just gets thinner and thinner all the time, rather than the kind of thickness I think that's appropriate for serious Christians. But if we want that thickness, we need to introduce people to it very slowly and deliberately by giving brief words of instruction, even as we experience worship itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Dr. Justo González. He is a native of Cuba, a retired professor of historical theology. For the last 30 years, he has focused on developing programs for the theological education of Hispanics. resulting in the foundation of the Asociación para la Educación Teológica Hispana, the Hispanic Summer Program, and the Hispanic Theological Initiative. Jointly, these programs seek to strengthen the Latino leadership in all churches at all levels of education and training. An ordained United Methodist minister, he has also published over 100 books, mostly in the field of history, but also on various books of scripture and on theology. His books have been translated into some 8 languages. The best known is The Story of Christianity in 2 volumes. His presentation for us today is, What Does Worship in the Vernacular Mean Today? Please join me in welcoming Professor González.
Good morning. The Lord be with you. It's funny, when I use the vernacular, you don't respond as well as when I use the more churchy language. And that's my point. As we all know, in less than 3 years, we're going to be celebrating the 3rd Centennial of the Protestant Reformation. As we also know, one of the things that the Reformation is noted for is its insistence in worship in the vernacular. But I think that needs to be clarified a little bit, because the notion that we usually have, that the Reformers simply say, well, Latin is a dead language, let's forget it, and now let's go into this language, that's the language that people speak, and that Catholics said, well, no, we have to do things the way we always did it, and we don't want to change. That was the truth, and there's much more to it than that. As a matter of fact, Luther refused having the whole service in German. He insisted in keeping certain elements, different elements at different times, or insisting in using also the Latin. Furthermore, as you know, a great deal of the early Protestant music, actually in some cases for a couple of centuries, was still written for Latin words. Furthermore, when Luther wrote his theses, his famous theses, he wrote them in Latin. And one of the reasons why it created the reaction it did was obviously because somebody took them and translated them into German without his knowledge and published, printed them, and so on. But when people like Calvin read the 95 Theses, they read them in Latin. Because you see, Latin was not a dead language in the sense in which we understand a dead language today. Latin was a dead language in the sense that it was nobody's native language. But it was the only common language that people across Europe could communicate one with the other. Which is the reason why every time Calvin put out a new edition, as you know, there are quite a few of them, every time Calvin put out a new edition of the Institutes, they were published both in French and in Latin. Because he knew, among other things, he knew that many people who were coming even to the Geneva Academy didn't understand French. So they had to teach in Latin. Now, what I mean by all that is that Latin is not at that point a dead language. It is what I would call a language of privilege. It is the language of scholars and to some degree the language of merchants. People who have to communicate with one another. So it's a language that's sort of like a cupola that expands all over Western Europe, of which the people at large do not participate, but that is necessary because that's the only way in which people can communicate. So it's a language of privilege. So by the 18th century, things begin to change. And then the notion of worship in the vernacular was connected with a growing spirit of rationalism, Worship was seen as true and valuable only if I understand every word, every gesture, every symbol, if there's nothing that I don't quite understand. As a result, worship in the vernacular was often understood as purely rational worship, worship devoted of mystery. And on the other hand, the Latin Mass, that had continued being in Latin originally, not just for the reasons that we always hear, but also because it wanted to retain its universality, the Latin Mass now was mysterious, not because of the actual mystery of what was happening in it, as much as because people didn't understand a word of what was being said. Now, much of that polemic now has been left behind. In a way, we all worship in the vernacular. The Catholic Church, after 400 and some years, finally decided that Luther was right at the Second Vatican Council. And now we have vernacular masses in just about every language in the world. So now we worship in the vernacular. Or at least, we think we do. You see, when I talk about the vernacular, we're not talking just about a language. We're talking about a culture, a whole culture, a worldview, a way of understanding the world, a way of interpreting, of communicating that understanding, and so on. And the question then is, how can we worship in the vernacular today when most of us belong to a culture of privilege similar to the culture of privilege of the Latin speakers back in the time of the Reformation? In other words, at the time of the Reformation, the reason why people like Luther and Calvin insisted in worship in the vernacular was because they realized that these things that they were able to learn, that these things that they were able to communicate, could not be communicated in the way in which they themselves had learned it. They had to be somehow transposed to the language of the people. And it seems to me that we have to begin thinking in those terms when we think about ourselves as pastors and worship leaders. In a way, we represent the Latin-speaking scholars of the 16th century. We represent that culture of privilege. And now privilege is not necessarily bad. The easiest way to respond to saying that we have privilege is to feel guilty about it and to go on a guilt trip. Privilege is not necessarily bad. Privilege is bad if you use it in order to retain control. Privilege is not bad if you use it in order to enrich those who do not have the same privilege. And so when it comes to worship, the question is, how do we, who belong to a culture of privilege, how do we now worship in the vernacular, but not just in the sense that we're going to do whatever the people want, but in the same way in which Luther retained the Latin, in the same way in which scholars were still communicating in Latin. How do we, at the same time that we do that, how do we use that in order to communicate the message and to give the experience of worship to our people? Now, I really don't know what the answer is. I'll tell you a few things, though. It seems to me clearly that more and more, those of us who are able to read music fluently are part of a culture of privilege. In most of our churches, most people can no longer read music. In many of our churches, people who cannot read music find themselves alienated because the worship is organized in such a way that they get the impression that they're expected to be able to read music. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to give up the privilege of being able to read music. It means that you have to find a way of using that in order to allow people who do not have that privilege to enjoy the same beauty of music that you can enjoy with your privilege of music. In the tradition in which I was formed, and in which I still worship most often, the so-called mainline Protestant tradition. I'm afraid it's more old line than mainline, but that's another question for another day. In that tradition, we like to think that we worship in the vernacular. But perhaps we are like those back in the 16th century who did not realize that Latin no longer remained what it had been 200 years earlier. And that's part of what I'm talking about when I talk about the issue of reading music. But we worship in such a way that people who do not belong to our own culture of privilege very often are excluded. And that has to go with what I was saying earlier about the emphasis on rationalism years ago. That's one of the reasons why we have activity packets that we give to children, where the message really is, you don't really belong here, keep quiet. What's happening here is not part of your own activity. You're going to have your own private activity there doing some coloring. And that's one of the reasons why, as the population ages and fewer people can understand what's going on, our worship says less, and it's going to say less to that growing elderly population, because we have confused the vernacular with the lack of mystery. Because we have confused the vernacular with the sense that only what we understand happens. Now, in today's worship, what we have to look is for a vernacular worship in the sense that at the same time that it acknowledges that there are many other vernaculars. Respects and strengthens and encourages those of us among our own community who do not belong to who do not have the joys of the same culture of privilege that we do. But it's also a worship, a vernacular worship, in which our own privilege is used in order to make sure that this worship that we do in this very local, concrete community that doesn't know much more about what's happening in the rest of the world many times, that community is very clearly worshipped when the whole church universal, that back in Luther's time was connected through Latin, and today is also connected in many ways by our common culture of privilege. Can we do it? I don't know. But in any case, praise be to God. Gloria a Dios. Laus Deo. Thank you.
Thank you. And now it's my turn. I'm Karin Maag, as I said, director of the Meter Center for Calvin Studies, a professor of history at Calvin College. The Meter Center is a special research collection specializing on John Calvin and the Reformation. It is jointly overseen by the college and Calvin Theological Seminary. My research focuses primarily on social history of the early modern Reformation, especially in Geneva and in France, higher education in the 16th and 17th centuries, and on the training of pastors in the Reformation era. Among my recent publications is a volume of essays I co-edited titled Politics, Gender, and Belief, the Long-Term Impact of the Reformation. And my presentation for you today is titled as follows: How to Implement Worship Changes Without Losing Your Congregation in the Process. Lessons from Reformation Geneva. So this is a top 10 list. Now, let's be clear before I start, all of these items are not ones that Geneva did successfully. Sometimes we're learning from their mistakes. So, the top 10 list: how to implement changes in worship without losing your congregation in the process. I want to set the scene for you first. Geneva, in the 1520s, was a Catholic city. A decade later, it was a Protestant city. It went through amazing changes in worship, in making that transition. And what we have to understand is, well, exactly how did that work and what lessons can be learned from that? So if you just thought briefly about the kinds of changes Geneva would have gone through, they went from the Mass to the Lord's Supper. They went from a focus on the altar to a focus on the pulpit. They went from Latin to the vernacular, taking into account what Professor González has just said. They went from decorated church interiors to whitewashed walls. Few aspects of worship were left unchanged. So, what lessons can be learned? Number one, focus on the fundamentals and integrate these fundamentals into worship services. To assess whether Genevans were taking in the basics of what it meant to be Christian, the Reformed pastors of Geneva insisted that everybody know 3 basic texts off by heart and in the vernacular. And these were the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, and the Apostles' Creed. Now, understanding these texts, sort of getting the deeper meaning of the text, was a second step, but the first priority was to have people memorize these texts and integrate them internally. And to do so, all 3 texts were regularly recited during weekly church services. So there's fundamentals, and you use them in a worship service. Number 2, set the fundamentals to music. If you want people to learn new things and retain them, set them to music and use this music in worship. The Genevan Psalter, which the Genevans used in worship, had not only all 150 psalms, but also these texts I just mentioned, the Lord's Prayer, the 10 Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, all of them set to music to help people learn them. And this music was regularly used during church services. Number 3, use your young people. Genevan schoolboys had an hour of psalm singing a day as part of their curriculum. I think I would have liked that very much. An hour of psalm singing a day as part of their regular curriculum. So, of course, they quickly gained familiarity with this music that was then used in worship, and they were actually able to serve as almost a model for the congregations as to how to sing these psalms. Number 4, explain what you are doing and why you are doing it. The Genevans had liturgies for baptism, for the Lord's Supper, and if you read these liturgies, they come with long preambles that the minister would read through, explaining why the sacrament took place, why it was important, what its fundamental biblical foundation was, and this was regularly read as part of the service, so people could understand why the sacrament was being celebrated and what it meant. Week by week, month by month, people would hear the pastor explain why infants had to be baptized and why the Lord's Supper was to be celebrated. And these teachings, therefore, could take root in people's minds. Number 5, encourage worship practices in the home. The Genevan Catechism taught the fundamentals of the faith in a question and answer format, a standard catechetical format, but it also included a series of prayers. Prayers that were to be used in the home setting. Prayers when you got up, prayers when you ate, prayers after you ate, prayers before you went to work, prayers before you went to bed. And what this enabled was Genevans to learn a daily practice of worship that was integrated into their home and family life. And if it was used as it was intended, all Genevans would be kind of following the same model. So they weren't just getting worship on Sunday. They were having daily worship in their homes that linked them to what happened on Sunday and linked them to each other through this practice of using these prayers. Number 6, be flexible when necessary. If you want to make changes in worship and you have a great long list, maybe it's good not to have every single one of the things on your long list get accomplished. Calvin ran into this when he wanted, as has been said, the Lord's Supper to be celebrated every week. And the magistrates of Geneva said no. They thought that was too close to the Catholic practice, and they didn't want to do that. They said, no, 4 times a year is plenty, okay? We will do it at Christmas, at Easter, at Pentecost, and in September, and that's fine. Well, Calvin had to essentially decide what he was going to do about this. Was he going to make this a burning issue that he was going to fight about constantly and perhaps then lose other support? Or was he going to not insist on having his own way? In this case, he did not insist on having his own way. Number 7, retain older traditions if these are helpful and do not go against any core teachings. The one the Genevans did retain, which is one you may not be aware of, they retained the practice of having godparents. In Geneva, when a baby was presented for baptism, that baby was usually presented by the godparents. Calvin himself was godfather to over 40 children. Okay? They retained this practice. They found that it helped the Genevans make the transition from their older model of baptism to the new Reformed sacrament, and it also built spiritual kinship among families and created kinship links of support for the new families, kind of like the mentoring that Professor Sittser was just talking about. Okay? It served as a way to bind people together, and, of course, in an age where mortality rates were high, it enabled perhaps a security system for children who might lose their parents at a young age to still have that connection with adults and that spiritual mentorship as they grew up. Number 8, don't move too fast or make too many changes all at once. And this is a lesson from what went wrong in Geneva. Calvin's first years in Geneva, from 36 to 38, ended badly. He was sent into exile after only just over 2 years of being in the city. And why? Well, there were a lot of different factors, but part of it was that he and his colleagues really wanted to change things very dramatically. And among other things, they insisted that every Genevan swear his or her allegiance to a detailed confession of faith. And that didn't go down terribly well with the Genevan population. Plus, the ministers decided they really needed to control who accessed the sacrament, who had access to the table. And that kind of got people upset as well. They were just trying to change so many things simultaneously that, in a sense, they lost support. And in doing so, the 3 leading pastors of Geneva at the time were sent into exile. So don't change too much all at the same time. And Calvin learned this lesson. When he got back, the whole idea, and back in 1541, he was back in Geneva, he quietly shelved this idea of the confession of faith that everybody had to subscribe to. That idea was quietly dropped. Number 9, work as collaboratively as possible. Help spread the idea of change in a wider group. So, Calvin wasn't the only one in Geneva. The company of pastors, all the pastors of Geneva together, worked on making changes in worship and helping these be implemented. When Calvin returned to Geneva after his exile in 1541, the consistory was created, a body of pastors and elders whose job it was to oversee people's walk of faith. So in spreading the oversight, in spreading the responsibility for change, in a sense, Calvin could bounce ideas off his colleagues, and his colleagues could bounce ideas off him, and they could essentially work together as a team to make changes happen. And finally, be patient. It took nearly a generation for the majority of Genevans to make that transition from being Catholic to being Protestant. It is not automatic, it is not easy, it is not straightforward. Many older Genevans, of course, were very attached to the traditions they had grown up with, and they didn't particularly see any reason why they had to move from being Catholic to being Reformed. So, in your own context, are you trying to introduce new music to a reluctant congregation? Are you trying to bring in liturgical dance or reconfigure your worship space? Be patient. Understand that those who voice opposition may in fact be implicitly telling you something important about what they value, about what worship means to them, what anchors their own worship practice. Try finding common ground. And remember to focus, above all, on your common commitments to faithful servanthood and to following Jesus Christ. Thank you. All right, the consensus of the panel is we have time for a few questions. So here's how it's going to go. Raise your hand if you want to ask something to any of our panelists. If you could stand while you ask your question and project your voice, that will help. So, questions for any of our panelists. We have about, let's say, 5 minutes. Yes, go ahead.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I've been asked that a lot. It's a very good question. The question was, in the book of Acts, it's clear that baptism immediately follows some kind of conversion. And the whole notion of Ordo Salutis in Acts is complicated. I mean, sometimes you're filled with the Holy Spirit before you're baptized. So, but it's immediate. That's the point. And by the time you get to the 2nd century, it's no longer immediate. There's a delayed period. I don't really know how to answer that. I can guess, though. I think probably the most logical answer is that in the book of Acts, you're dealing either with Jews or fellow traveling Jews, so that their familiarity with the larger biblical story and so on is much greater than you'd find in the pagan world. So even the Ethiopian eunuch is not reading a romance novel. I mean, he's reading the book of Isaiah. And Cornelius is another example. He was a fellow traveling Jew, a God-fearer. And then you had a lot of Jewish conversions too. So I think the step into Christianity was a little bit easier and smoother. It would be like a Methodist becoming a Pentecostal or something. By the time you get to the 2nd century and you're reaching pagans, think about the project, the challenge that presented. I mean, these people knew nothing. They didn't know the story. They didn't know the ethics. They didn't have the worldview. And to baptize somebody would be baptizing them into nothing. They wouldn't understand a thing. And you had the threat of persecution. So it would have been easier to apostatize because the faith would have been so fragile. So I think that probably forced a delayed period so they could prepare them more meaningfully, not just for baptism and confirmation and Eucharist, but for the cost that might be associated with becoming a follower of Jesus. In fact, it's interesting, in Hippolytus, he answers the question, what happens to people if they're martyred before they're baptized? And his answer is, oh, that's okay, they're baptized in their own blood. Not a big problem for us in the West. Thank you. Great question.
Other questions? Oh, okay, I've got somebody pointing. Now, where is it pointing to? That's what I need to find out. Who's got a question? Over here? Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I'm curious about keys that you would put into leaders' hands today. From the view you just shared, if you would pick one key that leaders need today to apply that wisdom in church today, what would that be in all your four areas?
So, are you talking to any particular speaker or all of us?
Yeah, all of you.
All of us. So the question is, are there key insights that we should recommend to worship leaders today? That's your question? Okay. Anybody got a key insight here?
I think if I had to pick one, it would be a far greater understanding and constant stress on the meaning of baptism. I think preaching, it's a different matter if you think you are preaching to the baptized, who are gathered as the community of faith. The Bible has something to say to them because they are the people of God, but it is their baptism that calls them to that. And I think there should be a reference to baptism in every single service. I think preaching ought to be based on the fact that that's whom you're addressing. And I think that would help the church enormously.
Amen.
All right.
I totally disagree. Only kidding. I'm never going to disagree with these two. I would say slow and steady and small. To change a church culture, you got to start really small. So if you want to change a culture, say, of a church membership, start with the elders and disciple them. It gradually spread out. We like big, massive changes, so we just instigate something. But I think slow, steady, organic is the way to go. Thank you.
All right. I think at this point in time, we're just about out of time. I want to make sure we honor our time and let you get to your next session. Our next session is workshops A that start in various locations at 11:45. Please join me in thanking the panel once again.